It is so hard to believe it's May. I don't know about you, but for me, yes, it is. Several months ago, I was asked to give a talk on leadership to a group in Las Cruces. And so I had a couple of months to kind of ponder it and decide what to come up with. And it occurred to me one day that there is so much leadership during the Cold War drive to go to space, the space race, that seemed a very logical place to start. And most of you, if you're familiar with space, will know the characters in this story today. 4 of them that we'll look at did all of their work in New Mexico. 3 of them did all of their work right here in the Alamogordo area and southeast New Mexico. And most of what they did probably made a difference in your life of someone you might have known, might have affected you directly, and we will look at that today. So when I started to look at leadership, I thought, well, who are the leaders? And you go to the bookstore and you look in the leadership shelf and you see a lot of books written by people who tell you how to do it, but have never been leaders. They make millions of dollars on sitting at their computer saying, this is how you should do it. And when I looked at the 4 gentlemen that we'll study today, I thought, this is a given. These guys are born leaders. Why? Well, one, they were very humble. They were they expressed a lot of humility. As an example, and I had a chance before he passed away a year ago, January, I believe, to interact on several occasions with Joe Kittinger. That's probably a very familiar name to you all. And when you talk to Joe, he always said, don't put me up on a pedestal. It wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for Dr. John Stapp. When you watch documentaries on Dr. Stapp, he will tell you, wasn't me that did it, it was those guys that went out there and actually did the work. And so they were fully prepared to give everyone else the actual credit and not be of the ego that they would stand there and say, yes, I did it all, and forget the folks who actually made the difference. So with that, the first person that we're going to look at today, and who actually had leadership and developed the leadership of 2 of the other gentlemen, is Dr. John Stapp. Fastest man on earth. I would encourage you, if you want to see a really fun video, go to YouTube. Some of you will not know this. Groucho Marx, You Bet Your Life, and Dr. John Stapp. 3 months after he did his record-breaking sled run, he was a guest on that program. I think he was 39 years old. He had yet to marry, and it's fun to watch the interaction between those 2 gentlemen. So what made Dr. John Stapp a leader? Well, first of all, he was born to Baptist missionaries who really weren't well off financially in the world. They were in service in South America, in Brazil specifically. It would be 6 years before he ever came to the United States. His first language was Portuguese. And when he was in college, staying with an aunt and uncle, at Christmas time, a young nephew of his threw some Christmas wrapping paper into the fire. It erupted, caused what they call a backlash, and it blew out and consumed that little 6-year-old boy, who lay there for 60 hours in agony. And because Stapp was there when it happened, he nursed that boy for 60 hours until he passed away. And he said, I'd never seen anyone die before. And he decided at that particular time that he wanted to do something to better the human condition. And as a human being, he went out, he got his degrees, he put one of his degrees on hold so he could pay for and give the opportunity for a brother in El Paso to go to dental school. And then he went on and did the rest of his work. So a little bit of backstory here, how this technology we needed to develop it. We know about Operation Paperclip. We brought the German engineers to southeast New Mexico to work at what was then White Sands Proving Ground. When they offloaded all of the hardware that they went through Germany and grabbed, and Europe and grabbed, it took 300 railroad cars to bring all of that hardware to White Sands Proving Ground, where they started to build the rockets, have some successes, have some failures. And at that point, they realized one day we're going to put a human being on top of this big explosive machine. And so we have to come up with ways to protect them. And that was Dr. Stapp's impetus. He studied blunt force trauma. What happens to the human body in a sudden stop? He would always say it's not the crash or not the speed that kills you, it's the sudden stop and the crash that can cause great damage and can lead to death. So he comes to Holloman Air Force Base, Alamogordo Army Airfield, I believe at the time, from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, because he was getting ready to get out of the military and go into civilian life. What exactly he was going to do, he didn't know. But he happened to see a crash test one day at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and decided that studying that could be what he wanted to do to donate to better the human condition, and decided to delay his getting out of the military and wanted to lead a group of people in studying this new technology, this new science. So they send him to Muroc Airfield, which is now Edwards Air Force Base in California, where he started to ride sleds. He rode a total in his career of 29 sleds, about half of those before he came to Holloman Air Force Base. And his record sled test was on December 10th of 1954. So what does that make this year in December will be the 70th anniversary. And on December 10th of 1954, we'll look at some actual film of this particular run later. It took them an hour to strap him into his seat. By then, he had ridden several sleds. You see one of them here. You see in the larger picture, actually, I believe he's preparing to do the sled run, and in the inset photograph is about the moment of stop. It shows that if you're in a vehicle or if you're in a crash, the body inside keeps moving, and that's where the damage comes from. So on December 10th of 1954, you see in the upper left-hand corner and the upper right-hand corner, takes them an hour to secure him to this particular sled. You'll see later in the film where he's not just actually sitting there, they're actually securing his head to the seat. And let's count off here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. At 1, they light the pusher rockets. At 5, he hits 632 miles an hour. At 5, he hits the water braking system that they have. And so you go from 5 to 6 to 6.4. In 1.4 seconds, he comes to a dead stop. He takes 43 times the force of gravity on his body. The straps that they took an hour to put him into the restraint system actually saved his life. All of the blood vessels in his eyes burst. He thinks he's going to be blind. He always parked, by the way, 2 vehicles at the end of the test track, one an ambulance and one his Cadillac, because he knew he'd go home in one of them. This time it was the Cadillac, or the ambulance, and it wasn't home, it was to the hospital. So he comes to a dead stop. Why did he actually ride that sled? He's a colonel. He could order anybody to do that. He was very well known for saying that I would never put someone in a situation, and I'm paraphrasing here, but I would never put someone in a situation where I would require them to do something that I had not already done myself, that I had not already taken the risk of doing that myself, which I think is a very humble quality of a leader. Of course, there was also the situation where the folks who built the sled brought it out, put it onto the sled track, and said, "We're not riding it. Who's going to ride it?" And they all looked at Dr. Stapp, and he rode the sled. So he comes to a dead stop. He suffered some severe body damage. He goes to the hospital, and when he gets out of the hospital, he decides to go on a campaign for seatbelts. Because at that time, at the Alamogordo Army Airfield, there were more airmen dying in car crashes than there were pilots dying in airplane crashes. And that was just the opposite of what we had experienced at the beginning of the airfield out there during World War II. We were trying to train bomber crews. It was going so fast that safety protocols were not followed. A lot of those crashed. A lot of men died. A lot of men were killed. And just as a bit of trivia, does anybody know who would go on to be a famous politician trained as a bomber crew member here at Alamogordo Army Airfield during World War II? George Wallace. So George Wallace spent some time in Alamogordo. Dr. John Stapp also came up. He had an underling by the name of Murphy. You can probably all see where this is going to go. And one day on a test, Murphy hooked up everything wrong. And they got no results from that expensive test whatsoever. And that is where Murphy's Law comes from. If something can go wrong, it will go wrong. This could have been a very frustrating situation, and I'm sure it was to him. But rather than dwell on the fact that we didn't get what we wanted, he comes up with a little tidbit of information, and that's now in the lexicon of our American language. So, you see where he hits the water braking system right there, that huge plume of water above him, and that's the sled in the lower right that we had before it was taken by the Smithsonian. It was on loan to us from them, and I believe it's in the process of being rehabbed. But we are talking for the 70th anniversary of getting a model of that to be able to put out into our rocket park as well. So hopefully that will be coming pretty soon. That's Dr. Stapp at the hospital. Risked his life so that no one else would. Risked his eyesight so that no one else would. And you could see the damage just probably an hour and a half later as his eyesight is slowly starting to return. He actually thought that one day his test would render him blind. And so he at home would practice with a cane in case that ever happened. Time magazine called him the fastest man on earth, and he had a desire to go to 1,000 miles an hour. And he was going to do it himself because he had suffered so much damage on that particular ride. He wasn't going to sign anyone else to do it, but he wanted to do 1,000 miles an hour on that 10,000-foot test track out there. Now about 10 miles, but it was around 10,000 feet then. And so following his test, the military sent down a sled with an anthropomorphic dummy on it. They didn't get their math right. It hit the end of the track. It went cartwheeling off into the desert. And the government said, that's it, no more human testing. So he is the last man to ride a rocket sled, and he is known forever as the fastest man on Earth. This is 30 years out here in our rocket park where Dr. John Stapp came up 30 years after the original test to do some documentary information. And this is what Dr. Stapp did. So you see them putting him onto the sled right there. As I said, it took about an hour to do. You've got to imagine what's going through his mind at that time. One guy gives him a pat on the shoulder, and they all walk off and leave him sitting by himself in the desert. They light the pusher rockets, and there he goes. If you've ever ridden a roller coaster, you probably have 0.1% of a feeling of what that's actually like. There he hits his water braking system and comes to a stop. Here's another view of it right here. They don't know whether he's dead or he's alive. And they come rushing out to find out. And as I said earlier, 2 cars, this time it's in the ambulance. And off he goes.
Did he get a concussion too?
I believe so, yes. Wayne Matson, if some of you knew Wayne and Mike Smith when Mike was the registrar here, Dr. Stapp was a genius, but they both said that friends of his at the time recognized that after that ride, there was just something a little bit different about him. That even though he was extremely intelligent, he lost something somewhere because of that sled ride. Another little bit of trivia that's always fun. Sometime in the late 1950s, early 1960s, Dr. Stapp got a ticket for speeding on White Sands Boulevard. It was Pennsylvania Avenue then, some of you might remember. And he went to see the police judge. And the police judge looked at it and dismissed it. It was a $10 ticket. This made international news as far as Australia. And the police judge wrote a ticket to a fictitious radar, and paid the $10 himself. I had a chance to interview, if you knew Wyatt Atkins. Wyatt is Bert's father. Bert was the first district attorney ever reelected in the 12th Judicial District. And I asked, because he was the police judge at the time, Wyatt was, and I asked him if that was him, and he just smiled, wouldn't say. So Dr. Stapp was well known for making news in more than one arena. Dr. Stapp in 1953 developed the air-powered sled known as the Daisy Track. We have that on display here. If you've seen the movie A Christmas Story, little Ralphie wants a Daisy rifle. It's air-powered. You pump it up and you pull the trigger. If you have not seen the Daisy Track, go on out there. It's a giant air compressor, and compared to the cost of rockets, we could send a test subject down for about 5 cents worth of air versus expensive rockets. That is Captain Eli Beating, who rode the Daisy Track more than 50 times. You are seeing the moment riding backwards that he hits in the lower part of his back for a brief part of a second, 83 Gs. If he had been riding forward, there's a mathematical formula, I don't know what it is, but you saw earlier on the sled where the sled stops, but Stapp keeps his body is moving forward. There's a formula that your inner organs weigh hundreds, if not thousands of pounds when that sudden stop occurs. And if he'd been riding forwards, those organs would have continued on. Riding backward, that seat protected him, and he didn't park 2 cars at the end of the track, but he went home in the hospital, in the ambulance that particular day. So if you've not seen our Daisy Track, go out and take a look at it. So I mentioned Dr. Stapp went on a campaign for seatbelts. He also was instrumental in, if you remember the old cars in the 50s and 60s that had the big shelf above the back seat, he was instrumental. He started the annual car crashes conferences in Detroit, Michigan, which still go on to this day, although I don't think they're annual. He was instrumental in getting rid of those because people would put items on those shelves, and in a sudden stop, a crash, those items would come off, and there were instances where people actually got decapitated. So he was instrumental in that. So Dr. Stapp decides we need to test seatbelts. How are they going to work? Once again, he's head of this group. He could assign someone to do it. Dr. Stapp decides to do it himself, and I'm going to show you that video here in just a moment. But this article, I believe, is from 1959. He was 49 years old at the time. And every once in a while in a person's life, something he has done will come back to reward him. He tested the restraint seats, and in 1959, he was in the back seat of a T-33 where the WISO, the Weapons Systems Officer, normally sits. He was being flown by a pilot from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to Denver to give a talk to the American Rocket Society. And approaching Denver, one of the engines failed, and the plane started to descend. And the pilot told Dr. Stapp to eject. These were the very restraint systems he tested and oversaw other testing that other people did. He landed safely, no broken bones, till the wind caught his parachute, drug him across the landscape, and he broke an ankle. The pilot waited till he was clear. By that time, the plane had gotten somewhere like 1,000 feet off the ground. The pilot ejected. There was not time for the parachute to open, and he fell to his death. But the very systems that Dr. Stapp proved would save pilots, would save astronauts, would save you if you've ever been in a car crash, saved his own life. So it's September of 1956, and Dr. John Stapp is testing seatbelts. This is out at Holloman Air Force Base. cable is pulled backward. Normally a cable would be let loose, but it's not. It still remains on the seat. He's his own test dummy. And there's Dr. Dave Simons with his back to you right there. We'll talk about him next. So he could have ordered anybody else to do it. He's the fastest man in the world. He's got accolades. He doesn't have to do it. He is still interested in bettering the human condition. Dr. Dave Simons, he was part of the Man High program. Man High were 3 gondola flights, not from this area. I think they were done in the area of Crosby, Minnesota, from an open pit copper mine, so that the balloon would inflate. At the time of year they were doing this, we were having some severe winds out here, which we've had recently, so you know how bad those can be. So they went to an open copper pit mine, and by the time the balloon and the gondola got above the ground level, the balloon had inflated enough that it was safe. Those balloons were about the width of a piece of hair, so they're very prone to being damaged if they weren't treated properly. Dr. Simons is the first man to spend a night in space. He was a medical doctor. He wanted to be the first in this gondola, but Dr. Stapp, who oversaw the program, as I said, recognized that before we send someone up there to spend a longer period of time, we have to send a test pilot, because something could go wrong, and test pilots are well trained and versed in adverse situations. So they chose Joe Kittinger. Joe Kittinger went and did his mission. Man High 2 would be Dr. Simons. On August 19th of 1957, and he was chief of space biology at the Air Force Missile Development Center. And by the way, he was a little upset he didn't get to be first. But in choosing Joe Kittinger, it ensured that Dave Simons would have a far better chance at success. August 19th of 1957, Simons squeezed into the Man High 2 capsule to experience conditions firsthand. We did not know if a human being in the upper atmosphere would not be able to survive. We would go on to test the chimpanzees to see if they could do tasks in weightlessness, but we didn't know whether a sentient being could actually think and communicate and respond. So Dr. Simons was in something about the size of a phone booth, 8 feet by 3 feet in diameter. He was the first human to see the actual curve of the Earth. Take that, Flat Earth Society. And it took 2 hours. He ascended about 1,000 feet a minute. It took 2 hours and 15 minutes to reach 100,516 feet. And he was so excited that he set about doing his tasks, and he didn't eat. And so several hours into the mission, he started to feel sluggish, his blood sugar dropped, and he had trouble communicating. And he realized this, and he had some snacks. He ate those snacks, and that brought him back to normalcy, and he set about doing his tasks. So around 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night, he realizes he's got to get some sleep. He's in a gondola with 200-foot radio antennas stretching underneath him. And he's awakened about midnight by this bright flash going off, on and off, in his gondola. It's a CO gondola. And he realizes the humidity has caused one of his camera flashes, or one of his camera flashes, to malfunction. And he takes care of that. And he looks out the window. It's a very small porthole window. And he looks at his altimeter, and he has descended dangerously low in the cold air of the night in the upper atmosphere. So low, in fact, that his 200-foot antennas are right above a raging thunderstorm with a lot of lightning. And so he starts to eject. I think there were some batteries, a couple 100 pounds of batteries on the outside. He drops those, he ejects those, and he ascends. By the time he ascends back up, the sun has come up. He is hot because it's now about 80 degrees. It was below freezing beforehand. It's now about 80 degrees inside that capsule. And he's starting to feel the effects of being in a cramped position for all of those hours. About 8 or 9 hours before they put him into the capsule to actually ascend, they placed him in there to get him comfortable, and they kept him cool with dry ice. and then they removed the dry ice and they sent him up. So he's been in this position, unable to really move around or about for a very long period of time. He descends and he lands 405 miles from his actual launch site. And he crawls out of his Man-High 2 capsule, and there's a farmer standing over to the side watching him come down. And he says, "Well, good morning, how are you?" He says the farmer was very unimpressed until here comes a helicopter to pick him up, and the farmer said, "You know, I've always wanted to see one of those." Simons broke all existing records for free balloon flight to that time. He was feted nationally by the Junior Chamber of Commerce in the United States as one of their 10 outstanding young men during the 20th annual awards in Phoenix. And he said, "The lesson of this unexpected but priceless experiment was abundantly clear. An essential quality would be stamina, not in a purely physical sense, but in a psychophysiological sense, a combination of deep physical reserves plus all the important emotional determination to use those actual reserves." How many of you seen the first ever Twilight Zone episode from, what was it, 1959, about the astronaut who's in an isolation capsule? If you've never seen that, that was kind of a play that happened 2 years after Dr. Simons, and I've read that reading about Simons' experience spurred Rod Serling to actually address that situation in his first episode of the Twilight Zone. So once again, you see right here, these men, when they started this project, did not know how to fly a balloon. The military said, "That's too bad. You're going to be flying balloons." Anybody who ever been in the military and kind of know that chain of command? Yeah, I can tell. So these pictures are from Dr. Simons' private collection. They were given to us with a lot of other artifacts by his daughter when he died. I want to say it was around 2010, somewhere in that time frame. And these are just candid photographs of them out in the Tularosa Basin learning how to fly balloons. So there you see him in his cramped capsule that he spent 9 hours before, I believe, liftoff. That's the figure I've read in a couple of different volumes, and his overnight stay. Put yourself in that situation. Could you do that? As I said, he was upset because Joe Kittinger did it first, but he wanted that experience, and he was the medical doctor, and he was most acutely experienced to be able to report what went on with the human body and the mind in that situation.
America, first official Air Force pictures of the highest balloon ascent ever made. The United States doctor, Major David Simons, has his gear adjusted for his adventure into the unknown. Fitted with a special helmet for this pioneering mission, the Major aimed to spend a 32-hour period at 100,000 feet above the Earth. That's 19 miles high. Up she goes, and from the miniature space laboratory he carries, Major Simons keeps constant radio contact with the ground. One of his main interests is to check his own reactions at a height 5 times greater than most aircraft fly. The 19-mile climb took 2 hours, journeying towards the mysteries of outer space. Reporting back, Major Simons said he could even distinguish the curvature of the Earth from the unknown frontier.
That's an older newsreel. Some of you are old enough to remember going to the movie theater and watching newsreels. Personally, I think the British were better at it. But that's an old newsreel that explained to the public what happened at that time. Dr. Simons is another prime example. He could have retired from the military. He could have gone into private practice as a medical doctor and lived out the rest of his life knowing that he had contributed and been a leader in finding benefits to the human condition. However, he decided to go into the study of pain. I believe they call it myophasia pain. It's a condition where if you've ever been in a car accident, you experience joint pain. For some people, it's lifelong. It can be debilitating. He spent the rest of his life studying that, writing books on it, and seeing patients who suffered with that. And toward the end of his life, he was interviewed and he said, you know, nobody ever wants to talk to me about the work I've done in pain. I've spent far longer in my life devoted to that than what the work I did out at Holloman Air Force Base. So you can find some of his books online, and that's what he spent the rest of his career and his life doing. Colonel Joe Kittinger. Colonel Kittinger came to Holloman Air Force Base through Cloudcroft, New Mexico. He had wanted to do combat in Korea. That never happened. He didn't really want to come to Alamogordo until he topped the crest in Cloudcroft, looked out and thought, this is a pilot's dream. I can fly every day here, any number of different aircraft, and that's what he set about doing, especially as a test pilot. He did the 3 Excelsior flights, and those were open gondolas that lifted him above the earth to test parachutes. Problem with pilots at the time, and there had been pilots who had suffered severe injuries and a minor number of them who had died because of faulty parachutes. If your parachute doesn't expand by a certain altitude, you go into a flat spin and it can be debilitating. So it was his job under Dr. Stapp's leadership to test parachutes. And as I said, he did 3 flights into the upper atmosphere, all above us right here. His third one, we'll talk about all 3 of them, but there's a photograph from his third one. You see him above the clouds, above the White Sands now National Park there. Another bit of trivia. This is Dr. Stapp on his sled run. Dr. Stapp told Joe Kittinger, we're going to run a sled on December 10th of 1954. He didn't tell Kittinger that he would be on that sled. What he told Kittinger was, I want film from above it to see what's happening. And he gets out his slide rule and he says, at this point, you need to be at this altitude, at this speed. Once you hit the track, you need to ascend to this altitude. You need to exceed this speed so that when we hit the water braking system, you will be right over the top of it. And so Kittinger thought, well, this is pretty important, so let's go out and test it. And they did numerous test runs. And on every test run, he failed to meet every mark, which I'm sure didn't make Dr. Stapp very happy. Morning of the sled run on December 10th, that's when Kittinger learns that Stapp's going to be on that sled. And this triggers something in his mind. This photograph right here, that is Kittinger above him, that is Stapp on the sled run, and that is the only time that they ever got that flight right. Quality of leadership is rising to the challenge. The first on the left there, that is the Manhigh that I told you, the Manhigh capsule that I told you Kittinger did preceding Dr. Simons. The one on the left, rather. The one on the right is Kittinger getting ready to get into the 3rd jump that he would make over the Tularosa Basin. So, on Excelsior 1 was on November 16th of 1959. He rose to 76,400 feet. One of the qualities that you find in all of these folks when you read about them is that this technology was being invented as they were doing it. Today, we have all kinds of red tape, rules, regulations. We have OSHA. You don't do anything till you've modeled it on the computer, et cetera, et cetera. But back then, the technology was invented and somebody had to test it. So it was the test pilot for these particular 3 flights right here. Excelsior 1, as I said, November 16th of 1959, rose to 76,400 feet. The rudimentary technology to give him some extra heat in this open gondola which would be far below the freezing point in temperature. You see how much suit he has on to keep him warm. The rudimentary technology, they put a bunch of bottled water underneath the seat because in freezing, the water gives off a little bit of heat. What they didn't realize at the time, and what Kittinger had to contend with, was he had a 150-pound, basically a fanny pack that would take his temperature readings, his radiation readings, his speed, and when he got to altitude, he realized that in giving off the heat, frost had formed on the seat, and his fanny pack was glued to that seat, and he couldn't get it loose, and all of a sudden, his automatic parachute timer starts. So he's wriggling around trying to make this happen, and it took him 16 seconds, which doesn't seem like a long time. But when your parachute timer is counting down, it can be life or death. And for him, it almost was. He finally gets it loose. He jumps. The parachute comes out far too early, and he goes into the flat spin they were trying to avoid. He spins twice every second, 120 revolutions a minute. Human body can't take that. All of the blood drains from his brain, and he passes out. About 10,000 feet, his second parachute opens up. He regains consciousness. He lands safely, and he proved that despite adverse conditions, if a pilot had to eject from a high altitude, guess what? That pilot could survive. Second jump was Excelsior 2 on December 11th, less than a month later in 1959. He went to 74,700 feet. Perfect. Nothing went wrong. He lands. Let's do this again. And that took place on August 16th of 1960 when he rose to 102,800 feet. And this shows you one of the qualities of leadership is overcoming adversity at the moment adversity sticks its ugly head up. His right glove on the ascent, even though it had been tested before he launched, failed to pressurize. And his hand swells up to twice its size. He starts to suffer frostbite. He has two choices, and ask yourself which one you would do. Do I abort the mission? The condition of, if he aborted, meant that the military was not giving Dr. Stapp money to run this program, all the money they needed. Dr. Stapp had actually borrowed a good amount of money from the Winds and Balloon Company to make this happen, and the Winds and Balloon Company never got paid back. The other is, do I just suck it up and go on up and do what I've been trained to do? What would you do? Kittinger sucked it up, and he went to 102,800 feet. His right hand is basically useless now. And as I said, he's got some frostbite. There is you'll see it right there in the picture on the right. There's a little sign that says the highest step in the world. And he steps onto it and he says a little prayer. Specifically, it was, "Lord, help me now." And he jumps. You see in the Tularosa Basin him rising up there. Took quite a while to reach ascension. It would take him 4 minutes and 36 seconds at minus 94 Fahrenheit degree temperatures to actually hit the point where his parachute opened. There he goes. He thought at the moment that he wasn't moving. He thought a cable had kept him attached to the gondola, and he rolled over on his back and looked up and realized it was ascending at a great speed. It wasn't actually ascending, he was descending, and he realized what was actually happening there. You see the white sands underneath him. His hand is useless. He can't cut off his fanny pack, so he hits the ground weighing 300 pounds. So a leader sucks it up and does what has to be done. There, he's going to hold up his right hand, I think, here in a moment. And he walked away. Now, like the other two gentlemen, or the other two gentlemen, he could have retired and lived off his laurels. Instead, because he had wanted to do combat, he'd not been able to do it in Korea, he volunteered to do combat in Vietnam. And he did, I believe, 4 deployments in Vietnam, did numerous combat missions, and on his last or next to last mission toward the end of his career, He's wrapping up his deployment. He's getting ready to go home. He's flying over enemy territory, and he gets shot down. He's captured. He spends about 11 months in the Hanoi Hilton. That was one of the worst camps that the Vietnamese had during Vietnam. And he was tortured mercilessly. There's something called the rope trick, where his shoulders are tied, and it's excruciating. You can read about it online if you have an interest. He suffered from that for the rest of his life and other things he did. But what rose him up above others in that compound was that he found the other Americans, and for the next 10, 11 months, he would rally them together, try to keep their spirits up, come up with things that they could do together, and not look at the situation at the moment, but look at what the big picture is and how in a future period of time they would be able to go home. He says what kept him going was that in solitary, he would work out in his head how he could fly a solo balloon across the Atlantic Ocean. He gets home, he's exchanged in some of the other Americans who probably were kept sane and alive by his talks and camaraderie with them. They're walked across a bridge. The prisoners we had are walked the other way, and he comes home. And a few years later, he flies from the East Coast to, I believe it was Spain, sets world records across the Atlantic Ocean. And spent some years at a restaurant there, Rosie O'Grady's in southern Florida, where he grew up, his home, taking people on tethered balloon rides. You could go have dinner at Rosie O'Grady's, you could go out back, pay a few bucks, and go up in a balloon with Joe Kittinger. A final person is, let's see. Oh, by the way, I wanted to show you this picture right here. Dr. Stapp, another what I think is a good quality of leaders. Sometimes I think we have too many people who think they're leaders concentrated in a particular area. Small fish in big ponds, you might say. And Dr. Stapp spent the rest of his life in Alamogordo, New Mexico. He would go to Washington, D.C., and they would ask him, why do you want to live in that little hick town in the middle of nowhere in New Mexico? And he had a couple of responses. One, I can walk down the street and not get mugged. And two, you save up for a year to come vacation in a place where I live. And I have somewhere in my files, he wrote up 2 pages of the advantages of living in Alamogordo, New Mexico. And this is where he passed away. I think it was in 1st of November of 1999. He was a member of the Kiwanis Club. And he was very active in the community, too. He wasn't just the famous Dr. John Stapp. He was, you see a member of the Kiwanis Club right there. He was active with Crime Stoppers, and that gentleman right there is a very good friend of mine. He had a very distinguished career with the Alamogordo Department of Public Safety and the Otero County Sheriff's Department, and is now retired. And I won't tell you who it is, but that gentleman is sitting in the room right now. Dr. Simons, or Dr. Simon rather, would pass away in Covington, Georgia, where he spent the rest of his life doing medical research. Joe Kittinger died in Florida a year ago, I believe, in January, I think it was. He was 96 years old after enduring all of that. So our last person is Dr. Robert Goddard. Dr. Goddard wasn't in this area, but he saw the future distant horizons, and much of the success that we have in the space industry is due to the man we know as the father of liquid fuel rocketry. Dr. Goddard is also a very good example and a quality of leader in that you're going to get some criticism. What do you do with that criticism? Do you let it roll off your back? Do you take it to heart? Do you get depressed about it? Here's some of the criticism that he suffered in his lifetime. A newspaper, he started his career in Massachusetts, and if you can imagine the time period, this was 100 years ago, we didn't have all these noisy machines. We were in an idyllic society. There was peace, there was quiet. And here comes Dr. Goddard launching loud, noisy rockets that hit the ground, that hit buildings, that blow up, things catch fire. At one point, someone thought one of these newfangled airplanes had crashed, and they called the police. State police showed up. They listened to the complaints. They sent out some airplanes. They can't find an airplane crash. Somebody said, let's go talk to Dr. Robert Goddard. The state marshal, fire marshal, came to see him and said, you can't do that in Massachusetts anymore. One of his particular rocket launches before he left the state of Massachusetts, the headline was, Moon rocket misses target by 238,799.5 miles. So the fire marshal said, sorry, you can't do that. Now, this was, again, new technology, and one of the people who recognized this new technology was Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator. He sought out Dr. Goddard, and for the specific reason of finding out rocketry. Can that work in landing and takeoffs of airplanes on naval carriers? We do that all the time today. But this was the germination, the seed of that particular technology. So when Goddard told that he was done in Massachusetts, he and Lindbergh started to look around the country, around the United States, for a place that had line of sight, a lot of land. They could make a lot of noise and blow things up, and nobody would complain because they would be far out away from the city. And they chose Roswell, New Mexico. And that's where they came because Lindbergh got a $100,000 grant from the Guggenheim family. How many of you see Men in Black? So when Will Smith is running around the museum at the beginning, that's the Guggenheim Museum. They're a philanthropical family, been around for generations, and I believe they're still a philanthropical family. So they came out to New Mexico, and he spent, although he went back to teach at MIT, I believe, at one point, or another university, the majority of his time was done here. What is the quality of a leader? A quality of leader is someone who actually does something, as I mentioned earlier. There were 3 people working on rocketry in that time in the world. One was Herman Oberth, who came over to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip. In 1922, he wrote his thesis on how man one day would go to the moon and planets, and his doctoral advisors looked at that and said, yeah, right. And he did not get his doctorate. There was Tsiolkovsky in Russia, and there was Robert Goddard. Only one of those men was actually actively engaged in doing rocket testing, and that was Robert Goddard. So by 1930, he was in Roswell, and he was very successful in helping to pave the way for the future of rocketry. There you see some of the photographs from his career. In the upper left there, Harry Guggenheim is the gentleman of the Guggenheim family who gave him $100,000. And a little bit of trivia here. Here is Dr. Robert Goddard earlier in his career, developed this right here. Anybody know what that led to? Robert Goddard is the inventor of the bazooka. Last thing I have here is a headline. The New York Times was one of his most vociferous critics. They didn't like anything he did. And they criticized him fairly earlier in his career. The paper said he lacked, quote, the knowledge ladled out daily in high schools, saying that in the vacuum of space, a rocket has nothing to push against, so there is no way that it can actually achieve flight. Guess how many years it was until they apologized? He died in what'd you say?
Never apologized.
Well, they did. Very small. He died in 1945. They apologized when Apollo 11 landed on the moon.
Much hasn't changed.
No, it hasn't. So, those are folks who had a big impact in some way, most likely on your life, especially if you're a pilot, you've been in a car crash. Every one of those developed a quality of leadership basically by acting and not sitting around and telling someone else how to do their job. My last slide here is, we're going to jump to questions. Anybody have any questions? It's a little hard to see.
talking about seatbelts or that sort of thing, my father was a pilot in the Second World War, and as soon as he found out that Sears was selling seatbelts you could put in the car, I grew up in seatbelts. I don't even put a car in a garage without my seatbelt on. So.
Yeah. Having been in a couple accidents, they can be lifesavers.
Mike,
Yes.
down front, Cliff. Speak, Cliff.
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm having trouble.
Left.
Oh, got to sing.
You a tongue-in-cheek question.
Okay.
You said Goddard was in Roswell shooting off rockets because there was lots of space and whatnot. He could do that?
At the time, his Mescalero Ranch was a ways outside of town, I believe.
Oh, okay. So you've anticipated my question.
I probably didn't. I wasn't specific when I.
He wasn't around there shooting rockets in July of 1947, was he?
No, he died in 1945. I see where you're going with this.
Okay.
No, he wasn't. There's some evidence, though, that he had more than 200 publicly filed patents, and there's some evidence and belief that the Germans might have accessed those patents when they were building their rockets. But they didn't arrive till September of 1945, and he had died a month earlier, so the two of them never crossed paths. Now, if you'd like to see, he was a member of the Rotary Club of Roswell. When he died, they went and collected all of his tools, which were created in the 19th century, that he used to create his 20th century technology, and those Rotarians recreated his lab in the Roswell Museum and Art Center. So if you'd like to see what he actually had to work with, I look at that stuff and I thought, how did they accomplish what they accomplished? There was a man, the last member of his crew died. His name was Lowell Randall, and he was a teenager when Goddard moved there. And he was a very intelligent guy. He never went to college, but he had developed a rudimentary gyroscope, and he took it to Dr. Goddard to see. Now, imagine, here's this famous educator and rocket scientist, and there's a teenager saying, look at what I built. And Dr. Goddard was very nice about it, but said, you know, just at this point, I can't use you on my team. So, Lindbergh was instrumental in starting up classes around the country where you could learn to be a pilot. And one of these was in Roswell. Mr. Randall decided to take one of these classes, and as fate would have it, he's sitting right next to a woman who is learning how to be a pilot too. Any guesses as to who that woman was? Goddard's wife. And one day in class, Lowell Randall brings his rudimentary gyroscope, and he says, look at what I built. And she said, you need to meet my husband. So he got hired. He eventually worked at White Sands. He eventually worked in Alabama at Redstone Arsenal. And he spent his last years in a home in Las Cruces. And our former curator, George House, and I heard that. And we actually went down to interview him. And he by that time, his mind was it was hard for him. And so it took 2 interviews. He could talk for about 15 minutes before he started to wonder. But we actually got to meet this gentleman who, through perseverance, excelled in his career, worked at these incredible facilities, even though he never went to college. I'm not endorsing that, but it's just a quality that you don't find in some people. Failure is failure, and you just don't want to move ahead. He was told no, and he persevered.
Michael.
Yes.
John Stapp, when he did his sled thing, he was facing forward, and then the next sled test, they were facing backwards. Was that had Stapp been facing backwards, would there, or do you know if there would have been the amount of damage that he sustained during facing forward versus backwards?
I think, thinking about the math, probably not. Eli Beating did not. He did not burst his eye vessels, his blood vessels. But Eli Beating wasn't going 632 miles an hour. This was like a quick 10-second ride. It was just out and come to a dead stop. The daisy track was only 110 feet long. It was expanded to 240. So it was bam, hit the button, bam, stop. So he was not able to achieve the speed that Dr. Stapp actually achieved. But the daisy track was used to learn what best position to put people in case of a crash. That was one of the purposes. And what did they find out? That you can best survive a crash by riding backward. And that's why if you have kids or grandkids, you are told that your car seat has to go in for that child and the back seat has to be backward.
Was Kittinger involved with the Red Bull balloon thing in Roswell a number of years ago?
Oh,
They went above 100,000 to...
That's a really good question. Yes, he was. Felix Baumgartner. Kittinger was on his team when Bob Gardner was breaking his record, and he was sitting in the control booth outside of Roswell, New Mexico.
He was Capcom, I think.
Was he?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's humble right there. I use as an example, I read a story when The Simpsons, I think Gunsmoke was the longest running TV show until The Simpsons beat it. James Arness was not happy about that. He had nothing nice to say. Joe Kittinger, on the other hand, he was there helping him do that. All right, well, I appreciate you coming today. We all do. Take the rest of the donuts so the staff doesn't have to eat them.
Please.